Today's video is a little bit different from the ones before in that it's a response to a question that's been raised, a comment made on one of the earlier videos, and rather than sit down and type out a long response, it actually seemed to make more sense, well, let's do a little talk about it. So I'll try and do this with as many as I can as they come along and when I get the time to do it. There have been some nice ideas for different talks in some of the comments raised right from the very start. But this one I thought I'd deal with because it fits in very much with the Eagle and the Lion, the Roman Parthia theme. And we'll start off with this. And this is the question of Cataphracts, Clibinari, the very heavily armoured cavalry that became the key feature of, they were there in the Parthian army, but particularly under the Sassanian Persians, they very much dominate the battlefield as far as the Persians are concerned and their war effort. And the question raised was, well, how is it that the Persians, who are part of an empire that's big, but it's less wealthy, less highly populated, it's smaller than the Roman Empire, could field rather more of these horsemen than the Romans ever seemed capable of doing? You know, what does it come down to? Money? Is it something to do with the society? Sometimes people refer to it as a form of feudalism, though of course medievalists today tend to get a bit worked up about that as well, so you have to be a little bit careful what you're saying there with broad brush. But really it comes down to this. How is it that Persian armies in particular field very large numbers of high quality and heavily armoured expensive horsemen, and the Romans never quite match these in numbers? That they do deploy these troop types, they do have units of them, they never seem to have quite so many. So obviously that's at the very least two big questions rolled into one, in that why are the Persians doing this and able to do this, and why do the Romans not or can't do it if they wanted to? And within all of those things there's lots of extra questions, and there, as with so many things, there are lots of issues where we can't actually give a definitive answer to this is why a Persian army is like this is why a Roman army is like that. But let's look at it a little bit from the Parthian and the Sassanian Persian side. The origin of the cataphract is not entirely clear, although we really see them first used in the form that is similar to that will be used by the Parthians and to some extent by the Sassanians, of close order shock cavalry, usually armed with lances with a kontos that quite often is held in two hands. These really appear in numbers and as a significant battlefield force under the Seleucids. There have been some under the Achaemenid Persians, but it doesn't seem a major part of how the Persian army fights. And they don't seem to make that much impact when they confront the Macedonians under Alexander. But the Seleucid cataphracts do have some successes, possibly even, depending on which sources you choose to believe, at Magnesia against Roman legionaries. They certainly impressed people. The idea of a man looking like a statue, so covered in armour that even his face was a mask on the helmet, so he didn't show any expression. It was a rather chilling, dehumanising image that these people were particularly frightening. With the Parthians, we see them as one aspect, one part of the predominantly cavalry armies that they field. But again, a reminder of something I've talked about in earlier videos and do very much in the book as well. We are dealing with this central problem that evidence is so slight for Parthian and Sassanian Persian armies. And in terms of good detailed battlefield descriptions in our sources that might be reliable, though with ancient sources you always have to exercise a fair degree of caution, we jump from Carrhae, where Crassus's army is defeated, and then we're into the 6th century and Procopius and battles like Dara, before we actually have really detailed accounts of what a Parthian Persian army was like in battle. Now we have more information on the Roman side, but even so there are big gaps in terms of tactical usage, deployment, how the Roman army is actually working. You've got those wonderful descriptions of Josephus of a 1st century AD Roman army on campaign, but it's in a war that lacked pitched battles. There are lots of skirmishes, ambushes, sudden fights in difficult terrain, and there are lots and lots of sieges, and it's sieges that dominate. And Josephus is very good at describing those, but you don't have the field battles that you have in, say, Caesar's narratives. And Tacitus does deal with some, but Tacitean accounts are always quite rhetorical, and they tend to be précised down to be fairly brief. And some of his most detailed and longer accounts actually deal with Roman armies fighting Roman armies in the Civil War of 68-69, or Roman armies fighting armies that are partly Roman based when you're looking at the Batavian Revolt and the Army of Civilis. So there are problems even when it comes to understanding just how the Romans are doing things. So that's the context. In the Parthian case, we're told that by Plutarch that the Surena, who leads the army at Carrhae, had in his personal retinue 1,000 cataphracts, 9,000 horse archers. Again, go back to the video I talked about Carrhae itself. He's not saying that's the army that fought the Romans at Carrhae, but that's presumably a significant part of the army that fights the Romans at Carrhae. And there is a distinction. But that is the impression overall, that Parthian armies are predominantly horse archers, but they have significant numbers of cataphracts, these heavily armoured men riding heavily armoured horses, presumably drawn from the pick of the nobility and the retainers. Now, obviously, as the person who raised the issue pointed out, all this armour is expensive. And you need a horse that's bred and trained to cope with it, and you need a rider who is trained to operate properly, not get too fatigued by all this equipment. Like anything else, you get more used to it. The more you practice, the more you train with all this burden on you. And then on top of that, while like a medieval knight, a cataphract is quite formidable as an individual, they are considerably more dangerous and devastating as groups, as units. And that's something you also have to train for to do well. So it is a part of society that is able to devote sufficient time, effort and resources to training for its military role, and particularly its battlefield role. So cataphracts are something of an expensive luxury, but they are, because of that, quite dangerous, quite effective. However, we have to be a little bit careful, because after all, the Armenians have employed them against Lucullus's Romans back in the 70s BC. Lucullus outmaneuvered them and hit them with cavalry from one side, and infantry outflanked them and defeated them that way. Now, the Armenian army wasn't the best coordinated force. It was rather overconfident. It wasn't particularly well led. Nevertheless, the Romans thought early on, well, we can beat cataphracts. Plutarch and Dio, in the descriptions of Carrhae, give the impression of the devastating power of a cataphract's charge, how difficult it was to wound men who were so well protected, and the desperation of the Germans and the Gauls with Publius Crassus, who find that they can't take down their opponents, so some of them jump down off their horses and try and roll underneath and hamstring the horses of the cataphracts. Now, yes, that can work spectacularly sometimes, but it isn't a reliable tactic for everybody to use all the time. And they lose the combat, no matter how brave they are, because they're fighting against people who are just as brave, but also better equipped and just as skillful. But then when you have the campaigns of Ventidius Bassus a few years later, Ventidius persuades Parthian armies to attack him in positions of his choosing, and then counterattacks and uses slings and other missiles of various sorts, and defeats charges that presumably are led by the cataphracts more than the horse archers, because after all, that's the close combat is what cataphracts are for. So the Romans have used armies that don't have super heavy cavalry of their own to defeat cataphracts in those sorts of numbers. Now, by the time we're getting to the 3rd century AD, the rise of the Sassanian Persians, and after that, the wars that then follow, the impression is that armies of the Sassanians are less characterized by their Roman opponents as being predominantly horse archers, being predominantly men who will skirmish with you, who you will run away when you charge and keep shooting at you, wear you down until you're so weak that then they can charge you down. There is a shift more and more towards the emphasis on the armour of the cataphracts, on the sun glittering off the armour, but also their numbers, the bulk that they're dominating. Bear in mind something else that seems to come in at the same time is the use of war elephants. Now, war elephants by their nature are designed to get close to the enemy and terrify him or trample him. Even if you've got men in the howdah on the back shooting with bows, nevertheless, the main killing power, the main impact of these is as big, formidable-looking, frightening, terrifying, close combat weapons. Now, all of this is difficult to trace. We don't know when war elephants are first used, how frequently they're used. Back in the war under Nero, in the aftermath of the surrender of a Roman army, they have to build a bridge, and the Parthian King of Kings rides across on the back of an elephant. Now, do you just have elephants then for transport, for display? Are you also using them at that stage sometimes as a military force? Very hard to know. Our Parthian armies of the later 1st century AD, 2nd century AD, composed of rather more cataphracts in relation to the horse archers than the ones we see at in the 1st century BC, which again brings us down very much to Carhai and to some extent Plutarch's relatively detailed account of Mark Antony's operations. But everything else survives only in the briefest accounts. It's very hard to know what sort of balance of forces there are in these armies. The other big mystery all the way through with the Parthians and the Sassanians is their infantry. They're dismissed by Dio as not worth anything, or they're not even there. They don't appear at Carhai at all. There's no mention of the account, but can we assume from that there were none there? Possibly, perhaps not, who knows. We know from the later frontier defences that the Sassanians are building that they presumably have some fairly full-time, professional, in inverted commas, troops to man and garrison these. And when you have sieges at which they're very good, you have lots of Persian soldiers, and presumably before that Parthians, fighting on foot. Now, some of these may be dismounted horse archers, particularly dismounted cataphracts and noblemen to lead the assaults. Nevertheless, are there significant bodies of infantry that again appear a little bit by the time you've got to Procopius, but he doesn't really treat them with much respect. Neither they nor the Roman infantry play that much of a part, at least an active, effective part in the battles. But again, is that a reflection of our sources? We don't know enough about the balance, the makeup of Parthian and then Sassanian Persian armies to really say what they're like, because again it comes back to this fundamental problem. The battles are not described in any detail in our surviving sources, other than with these huge gaps of many centuries at a time. But there does seem to be this shift with the Sassanians to a much more confrontational style of fighting. Close combat. Cataphracts are good at that. War elephants, obviously, that's what they do. And perhaps more infantry as well, at the very least, as a supporting arm for both the cataphracts and the elephants and the like. Now, they're still using lots of missiles. They're still archers, dominate both infantry and also the cataphracts, the clibinari that appear. The Persian ones seem most, if not all, also to have carried composite bows and been very competent in their use. And you have the contrast between the way they fire, according to the Strategicon, and Procopius talks a little bit about different styles of firing. They emphasize lots of missiles rather than force and individual accuracy. And the Romans do things slightly differently, but both sides by that time are operating in quite similar ways. But the impression is that over the course of the centuries, and by the time the Sassanians establish themselves and then continue on into the campaigns in the 4th century and later, that the most important part of their army are substantial numbers of these heavily armoured clibinari and cataphracts. Now, they've come from somewhere. Presumably, as we've said from the start, it's been the nobility, the wealthier, the landowners who can afford the time, the equipment to operate in this way, to serve in this way, but with their households. So how often, there's this great emphasis in Roman accounts of the Parthians on how only a small minority of the population is genuinely free and nearly everybody else is a slave or somehow dependent on them. And are many of the warriors who follow you people like that, of that grade? Possibly. But again, you've got an outsider looking at another society that he is not the fairest, let alone the most favourable view of that society. He's bound to oversimplify. He's also got a rather jaundiced view of Easterners and Parthians and Persians as enemies, real or potential, and as barbarians, as not Greek, as not Roman, as different. So you have to be cautious. There is a much later Persian tradition emphasizing the training, the quality, the skill of these noble cavalrymen. It's very similar to concepts of knights and this sort of thing in many ways. These are people for whom it's part of their social obligation, their duty to local leaders, higher nobility, to local kings, to the King of Kings, to fight bravely and well and skillfully, and as a result to train and prepare for that, and to do so confronting the enemy close up. There is a great difference between a cataphract using a bow to a light horse archer, because the cataphract is not going to just gallop away when things get a bit dangerous. He is there, he is very close, tends to be fairly static as he shoots at the enemy, and then he is willing, if the enemy come close to him, he's not going to run away, he is going to fight them face to face, toe to toe, and he might choose to do that and charge them down anyway, and he's very good at doing those things. So it's a very different style of fighting, even though archery is still an important component of it. But you have later on people like Procopius referring to the immortals as a major element of a Persian army, matching perhaps whether it's just classical memories of the immortals of Xerxes' army when they invade Greece in 480 BC, or whether it really does reflect something that the Persians themselves are doing and think about, whether as a deliberate evocation of that ancient past, or whether it's something they do because it makes military sense and it's an elite within their army. Again, we can't really be sure because we don't get their version of it in enough detail. But there are thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of these heavily armoured cavalrymen. It's not always clear from Procopius whether the horses are armoured by this stage as well. And the same in the descriptions in the Strategicon. It might be a mixture, that some are, that some aren't. And of course, we've always got to wonder, do you have in these formations, you've got the most important, most prestigious noblemen and their sons in the front rank with the fully armoured horse as well as the best quality armour themselves, but as you go back in a formation you have the dependents who might have a slightly less expensive, less full version of the same panoply. Probably also true, you go back to hoplite phalanxes and the Greek armies of the classical period, that not everybody's necessarily going to have all the best kit, but they're performing basically the same function, they're part of the same unit. And they're still pretty well armed and pretty well trained and pretty highly motivated, even if they're not quite at the peak of all those things. Now, quite how this happens and how and why there are far more of these people in these later Persian armies compared to what we see of the Parthians in the 1st century BC is again very difficult to explain. There are lots of possibilities. It might be that they've decided that, well, when we do confront people like the Romans, we can't just do the old thing of relying mainly on light horse archers, running away, wearing them down, because Roman armies don't let us do that to them anymore. Therefore, we need to beat the Romans at their own game, but let's find a better way of confronting them in hand-to-hand combat. So let's build up the cataphracts, and it's a conscious decision. On the other hand, there might be going alongside this a sense that, sorry, if there are noises in the background to interrupt, it's Augustus the cat is jumping around from chair to chair, but it's that or having yelling outside the door. So Augustus and Artemisia, the two cats, are very likely to make appearances in these videos at some points, but at least they've got classical names, so that's something to be said in their favour. So what you might have, let's go back to the point at hand, rather than this very sort of classical digression into when you're telling the audience about something and you decide to wander off and spend chapters and chapters in a book talking about something completely different. I haven't quite gone to that extent. We're talking about the numbers, the balance in the army, the emphasis far more on the very heavily armoured cavalrymen, much more confrontational compared to the lighter, skirmishing, evading horse archers who wear the enemy down slowly. Now, it might be a conscious decision to beat the Romans at their own game, part of the sort of the arms race I talked about in one of the other videos, the sense that each side reacts to the other. On the other hand, there might be a social element that as over the centuries, now whether this begins with the Sassanian Persians or it's something that's going on under the Parthians as well, as the empire becomes more stable, more nobility are rewarded by the King of Kings by local kings with land, with effectively they get the produce of that land to support them, and quite possibly the benefits of long distance trade as well. Stability allows the regions to prosper, therefore there are more people with wealth, whether it's wealth that they have earned themselves or in many cases wealth that has been passed down as gift from one level of royalty to lesser royalty to noblemen and so on, so that you're putting people under obligation, which is why people will sometimes draw comparisons with feudalism. It's a similar concept, that you have more people out there who can afford this equipment and can afford the time for training and the levels of prestige as well, to show that you are an important man within this empire, within the various kingdoms, within the greater empire altogether, at court and elsewhere. Then you need to show that you are a man with even more retainers and even better equipped retainers. So if the Soranus back in the 1st century shows off his wealth by having 9,000 horse archers and 1,000 cataphracts, maybe by the 3rd century or the 4th century you need to have rather more cataphracts than that to really cut the mustard, to be a man of prestige, because it's what the King of Kings tends to want, it's what any overlords in between want when you're required to provide troops for the army, when that's mustered. So there could be a combination of, this is what we feel we need, this is how prestige works, we're wealthier, and therefore there are more people simply capable of doing this. And more people, again, that later Persian tradition, this sort of medieval memory of the training that these horsemen underwent and the extent to which they were able to devote at least a significant part of their lives to preparing for war and combat, is a reflection that more people are wealthy enough to do this, that more people have the resources and the leisure time to do this, but also that more have that sense of obligation on them to perform in this way, to prove their worth by being willing to risk danger and to fight and to be good at war. So again, it can go both ways. As more people are getting wealthier, perhaps there are more people wanting to be recognized as part of the nobility. And this could link into all sorts of theories of what's going on under subsequent later kings of kings, what's happening socially. Are there developing groups within the empire that become more prosperous and want more political say, more attention, and part of that is tied in, as it so often is in the ancient world, with their military obligation. But all I will say is that it's very hard to be certain about any of this. Lots of this is happening. We can see the end result where these armies have lots more heavily armed horsemen, and the impression is that they have more of these than the Romans are ever able to field, even by the 6th century, 7th century AD. But it is a mystery as to just what's going on. But that's part of the issue. Now, when we come to look at the Roman side of things, the development of cataphracts within the Roman army is a little bit hard to trace in its own right. We do have units that appear. The first formal unit of an auxiliary ala that is described as cataphracts appears under Hadrian, so early 2nd century AD. Trajan has given a unit the title of bearers of the Kontos. So they are lancers, in effect, in that they're wielding this two-handed spear. On the other hand, you get, for instance, the mention, just almost a throwaway line in Josephus, talking of one of the sieges, I think Jotapata from memory, but I'd have to check, where dismounted cavalrymen are chosen to lead the assaults across the ramps dropped by the siege towers because they are fully armoured. And that seems to imply they've got armour to at least part of their legs and arms, as well as just the body and shield and helmet of a normal auxiliary or legionary soldier. But we don't quite know who these people are. Are they provided by one of the allied kingdoms? There's one big problem. A lot of our information for Roman army units and their equipment comes from military sculpture, particularly military inscriptions. And when a unit gets a formal title, so when Hadrian has this ala that are described as cataphracts, we know, at least at the beginning, presumably that's what they are. They are men where at least the man is fully armoured, maybe the horse as well. It's a little bit harder for us to trace anything where a unit starts doing something, but it doesn't formally get recognition. It's not part of its title, or that aspect of its title isn't recorded, because Roman army units can be a little bit unreliable in how they describe themselves, and they don't always put down their full list of battle honours or other details. Depends a lot on the context of the mention of the unit. If it's an inscription of somebody's tombstone, they might put the whole thing in, or they might just say, you know, I served in this cohort, this ala, because that's all that needs to be there. And there is always that problem. If you want a modern parallel, look at all the survivals of slightly archaic terminology. You know, so that in the British Army, you'll still have fusiliers from a late 17th, early 18th century distinction, where they carried the fusil, a different type of musket to everybody else, and wore different caps and did all these sorts of things. You know, you get these terms that survive: riflemen, grenadiers, this sort of thing, that no longer mean what they originally meant, but become part of the distinctiveness of a particular unit. So we always have to be a little bit careful when we look at the Romans, not to take it all too literally, or at least to consider the possibility that a unit that's called something might not necessarily still be doing that. This might be an old honour, or it might be something where, you know, if you are a unit that are secretari or archers, are all of you archers all of the time, or can your soldiers also do other things as well, and can they also fight hand to hand when required to? Can they be, you know, even to the extent where there is some later evidence from papyri that suggests that you might, within a cavalry ala, have had either some men or perhaps particular troops, termai, who have different equipment to everybody else. So instead of having a whole unit of, in theory, 500 or so people who are cataphracts, perhaps you have your front rank, or perhaps you have an elite terma or two that have that. Now, we can tell from the Singularis Augusti and horse guards at Rome and this sort of thing that there's the impression there that you get men with different styles of fighting, different equipment. You get some horse archers in them, but the whole unit is probably not horse archers. You might get some men with the contos, you might get other variations, because this is a unit that's been drawn from, in theory, the pick of the auxiliary cavalry of the empire. But also there can be tactical reasons where it makes sense to have a variety of troop types within the overall regiment, for want of a better term. So we never quite know what's going on, because we're relying on this limited evidence, and we, as I say, we tend to apply a name and think, well, that must rigidly be, that's what they are, that's all they are. And it might not be quite as simple as that. So that's the general impression, that the Romans are relatively slow developing heavily armed cavalrymen of their own, and then they are in limited numbers. Now, the numbers will grow. There will be more appearing over the next century or so, but the big expansion appears to be in later antiquity, and people will then jump on fairly quickly to the Notitia Dignitatum. So we're going to, around about 400 AD, where there are quite a lot of units that are listed as Clibanarii or Cataphracti, particularly in the Eastern field armies, but they're in the West as well. And they'll appear, there are some mentioned in Ammianus' account of the Battle of Strasbourg, and Julian's oration on the same subject. So you've got cataphracts in Gaul and elsewhere. They do pop up. The Roman army does develop these very heavily armoured cavalrymen, at least some of whom probably also have armoured horses as well as armoured riders, and they do use the kontos. Takes them a lot longer before they seem to combine this Persian method of fighting where you have a cataphract, but he's also got a composite bow. That sort of thing comes in later. It might be around by the 6th century, though again, might only be parts of your units that have this capacity, but it's probably a lot messier and more complicated, but practical from the point of view of what was available and what actually worked. Now, the Roman response to dealing with the Parthians, again, something we've covered a little bit in other videos, is not, let's all suddenly have loads of horse archers and lots of cataphracts, we'll fight them at their own game, we'll beat them that way. But to develop, you doing greatly increase the missile capacity within Roman armies, but you also balance the army. There are more cavalry. Most of them are still the fairly standard, it's not a particularly useful term, but medium cavalry. They are the standard men where the man has armour very often, has a shield, has a helmet, but is not fully armoured, arms and legs as well. The horse isn't armoured, at least not substantially. The sort of standard, typical auxiliary cavalryman that we know from Trajan's Column and elsewhere, and plenty of tombstones and other monuments. So there are lots more of those. Roman armies defeat the Parthians because they work together, they're more balanced, they take care not to be broken up, not to be overwhelmed, and they'll march along. It might take them a while, but they ward off Parthian attacks and they move and systematically take cities, walled strongholds, that sort of thing, because they're good at sieges. But again, something I've tried to emphasize time and time again in these videos and in the book, we really don't know what's happening in the big campaigns and battles of the 2nd century AD, and many of the other encounters as well. So we don't know how the Parthians have changed, we don't know how the Romans are operating in any great detail, which means we don't entirely know why one side or the other wins a particular battle, because we know so little about them. Now, an interesting parallel is the historian Arrian, who's perhaps most famous for his account of Alexander the Great's campaigns, but was a Roman senator, governor of Cappadocia, imperial legatus there, and wrote, apart from his book on cavalry training and tactics, wrote a bit about infantry tactics, so that's very stylized and archaic, but also wrote his, what we know as the battle order against the Alans. And we know from Cassius Dio that he did confront an invasion, a large-scale raid, whatever it was, of Alan tribesmen during his time in Cappadocia. It's not entirely clear whether he fought the battle that he shows how he planned in his subsequent written work. But there it's interesting, and he's got about 1.5 legions, he's got an equivalent number of auxiliaries, he's got lots of missile men, foot archers, horse archers, artillery as well that are firing over the heads. But his defense against the Alans is based around getting them to come to him, and the Alans are described, at least in part, again, it's fragmentary, but at least some of them are Cataphracts, though perhaps a little bit less disciplined and ordered and trained than the Cataphracts of Parthia, let alone Sassanian Persia. But again, these are heavily armoured men, some riding armoured horses, whose charge is extremely formidable and frightening. He wants to meet them with a particularly deep formation of legionaries, 8 deep, 9th rank of foot archers behind, a 10th rank of horse archers, both shooting over their heads. The rear 4 ranks of the legionaries are also lobbing missiles over the heads of the men in front, probably lancier javelins. And the idea is that you will be a solid block that the enemy won't close with, won't be able to break through even if he does, while he's being continually pelted. He will eventually retreat. You will then open up the formation, allow your cavalry through for an ordered pursuit. There's a great emphasis on not getting out of hand, not being lured off. So that's a Roman response with a sort of, in a sense, a normal Roman army, though there are peculiarities that might be just something that the Cappadocian troops do, and might be tailored for this specific situation. But nevertheless, it's, broadly speaking, the Roman army with which we're familiar, changing its tactics to deal with a different type of problem to, say, confronting a lot of Germanic warriors somewhere across the Danube or across the Rhine. So the Romans don't adapt to confront the threat of Parthian armies in particular by developing lots and lots of super heavy cavalry of their own. And while they have more of them later on to deal with the Sassanian Persians, who've got significantly more in the first place, they don't ever match their numbers. They don't really quite turn their army into a mirror image of a Persian army. Although when you look at something like the Strategicon, which can envisage fully cavalry Roman armies, you start to wonder, actually, are they doing something? The difference is getting slighter and slighter. But if you look at Belisarius' campaigns and his 2 major battles against the Sassanian Persians, Roman infantry forms a significant part of his force in each case, and they play a role, even if it's an essentially static role, of being a little bit like Arrian's men, blocks of troops that the enemy will have trouble breaking, that have got lots of missiles to throw or shoot at him, and are useful points behind which your cavalry can rally when they're tired, reform, go and charge again. So that's a different type of usage. So the Romans never quite develop Cataphracts, Clibanarii in the numbers that the Persians do. Now, part of the reason for that is that they discovered other ways to confront and defeat Persian armies. As, again, Arrian might give us an idea of one type of way of doing this, but clearly the Romans win lots of battles, and they do it with this army that does change, that develops, that puts more emphasis perhaps on cavalry, but is still fundamentally a mixed force, usually with more infantrymen, significantly more than there are cavalrymen, that fights in a way that is broadly recognizable to earlier ways of the Roman army operating. Again, we've got to be careful. Think of all those campaigns described by Ammianus in some detail in his surviving sections. We don't really get pitched battles in them. You get some encounter actions, but it's all fairly confused. You don't get the two armies sitting down, setting up, deploying, fighting in a formal way. You don't get a Carhai, or something equivalent to the ones described by Procopius. But he does talk a lot about sieges. So, to come back to the original question, why don't the Romans produce far more of these super heavy cavalry? And that's one of the answers, is that they don't need to. They can find other ways of dealing with Parthians and then the Persians, and fighting with, they do alter the balance, they do get some of these cavalrymen, but it's never just an arms race of, well, it's Cataphracts that win or Clibanarii that win, so we'll need more of them, or at least as many as you've got, and that's how we'll beat you. They find other ways, they use other troop types. And of course, when you think about it, that's partly because even in the campaigns against the Sassanian Persians, let alone the Parthians, battles are relatively rare. In the surviving accounts we have, there's an awful lot of manoeuvring, marching around, of trying to fight the enemy at a disadvantage. And that's partly because both sides realise battles are dangerous. Yes, you can win a great victory, but you can also suffer a big defeat. It's a risk. And when your main objective tends to be, well, let's take fortified towns, forts, cities, that sort of thing, because we can either plunder them, which is great, or maybe even we can permanently occupy, then that's your objective, and that's something where your cataphracts are not your main force. They're not the main thing you need to do that. And so even though you might be dismounting many of these people in the Persian case, and they will then be leading your charges, as seems to be the case, it's not that they are doing something else. They're in a sense fighting more like a Roman legionary, in a traditional sense, fighting on foot, going for close combat. So it's a different situation. So we have to remember, it's one of the problems with all studies of ancient military history, is we focus a lot on battles, partly because they're easier to imagine, at least we think, and partly because the evidence tends to get drawn to these dramatic moments. But when you look at the war itself, then there's lots more other types of fighting that go on, and the winners are often the people who are good at that. So they're good at siegecraft, or they're good at the raiding, they're good at being nasty to their opponent, to the point where the opponent decides, okay, fair enough, let's negotiate for peace, what do you want? So again, war is not just battles, it's more things, and this is something where, although they don't get as much attention, we know that the Persians, and one assumes the Parthians as well before them, have significant numbers of infantry, some of whom are actually quite good at certain roles. And they can be a labour force during sieges, but they can also be a backup force of lots of archers deluging the defenders with arrows, but also taking part in attacks which may be led by the pick of your cavalry or cataphracts dismounted, but you need more warm bodies than that. You need lots of people to succeed in these assaults. So that's one aspect of it. The other thing, of course, from the Roman perspective is that not only are battles against the Parthians and then the Persians only one part of what the Roman army does, but as we've seen within those conflicts, battles are a relatively small part even of those campaigns. There's lots of other things you have to do. So infantry are a lot cheaper as garrison troops than cavalrymen. The basic thing, you don't need to pay for and then feed, maintain and keep healthy the horse. And in terms of defending a place, then infantry are just as good. Now, cavalry have the advantage that they can project force beyond your walls. They can raid, they can be a nuisance to an army that passes you, but they can also help you to dominate the wider area more easily than infantry, though infantry can do that to some extent. So there's a great use for men on foot. Cavalry don't need to be in the majority of this thing. They're a useful extra asset, but probably you need lots of rather cheaper troops. Now you could go back and say, well, the Romans don't have such a cavalry tradition, a horse riding tradition as Parthians first coming from the steppes and the Persians subsequently, and that broader, the Achaemenid Persians had this big tradition of riding that was stronger there than, say, in southern Greece. Partly a landscape thing, but it's also a cultural thing as well. And the Romans come again from Italy, where often a mule is of more value for transport or agriculture than a horse. It's different sort of country. So that Roman armies have been dominated by infantrymen for a very long time. And there's that tradition that this is how you fight. And of course it extends to, in the era of professionalization of the Roman army, as they get better and better at sieges, then again, this is very much a job for men on foot. They do the work, they do the assaults. They'll also, when they're attacking as well as defending. So the Roman army has to do lots and lots of different things apart from fighting the Parthians or the Persians in battle. Now, cataphracts are all very well in battle, but they are less useful outside. So, yes, you've got some of them in Julian's army at Strasbourg in the 4th century fighting the Alemanni, though of course they're mainly signalled because one of their officers collapses, and it causes the units and others around them to waver from wounds and from exhaustion. But heavily armoured cavalrymen can be pretty devastating. But in most wars in Europe, in North Africa, again, the enemy don't need to have cataphracts sent against them to be defeated. Ordinary cavalry, your ordinary armed and armoured but not super heavy Roman auxiliary cavalryman, is still a pretty formidable fighting force. When you're fighting tribes in Britain, in Germany, Dacians even, Bastani, people like that, or the Numidians. You don't want to go around chasing Numidian-like cavalry with lots of cataphracts, because again, they're just going to get exhausted, they'll never catch anybody. And the disadvantage of cataphracts is that they are very expensive, both to have in the first place, but then to maintain. You've got to keep those horses in good condition. All of that weight of equipment, as well as the rider, is quite a burden. It means you're not going very fast for very long. And strategically, your ability to move quickly is limited unless you have a pool of spare horses. But even then, that's another big expense, and it's not something the Romans are into, or is really practical in that sense. So it's not so much why aren't they doing this? There isn't really a good driving force to make large numbers of cataphracts attractive. We always tend to think of external factors driving the developments within the Roman army, but it's also possible that one reason for the increased number of cataphracts clibanarii in later antiquity is as much to fight other Romans as it is to fight against the Persians, let alone the Goths and others and various groups that appear. Because again, when you've got a civil war, you've got essentially the same army with the same military system fighting against itself. You need an edge. You need something special. And the most obvious one, and the thing you can see time and again in civil wars, is get more soldiers than the other side. Numbers will be on your side, then you will win. But kind of wondering if there's an element where perhaps having some cataphracts, having some clibanarii, having more cavalry that are heavier than the fairly standard medium cavalry, the auxiliary, whatever you want to call them, that the other side has, might give you an edge which might allow you to win the battle, which might allow you to become emperor or stay emperor. So there are those factors as well. We should never underplay the importance of civil conflict and the threat of civil conflict as a driving force. But on the whole, again, go back to thinking about what the Roman army is doing, and we can trace this more easily under the Principate, 1st, 2nd centuries, of an army that is largely dotted around in garrisons, mostly around the frontiers, and its an internal police force, it's a building force, it's an administrative force, it's as well as a fighting force against foreign outside threats and perceived enemies. For that sort of army, cataphracts are an expensive luxury that you don't really need, because there's not much that they can do that your ordinary cavalry, just with mail armour, a helmet and a shield, can't do just as well in those sorts of circumstances. In many cases he is better because he is less burdened down, and he is cheaper in the first place, so you can have more of them. So you could look at this, it's not an exact parallel, but think of the German situation in the latter part of the Second World War. You know, you build one Tiger or 7 or 8 Panzer IVs or a dozen Stugs, when the Allies are producing 20 or so, 25, 30 Sherman's T-34s to whatever you can do. So you're always going to be outnumbered. There isn't enough of an advantage for the Romans to push their cavalry into being a predominantly numerically large cataphract force. So it becomes a significant element. It's something the Romans have always done. The Romans have boasted since the earliest days that they copied the best ideas of the enemy. And they do this with tactics, with weaponry, with equipment, you know, the Gladius Hispaniensis being a famous example. They do it also with cataphracts. You know, they're copying this from outsiders, particularly the Parthians and then the Persians, and to some extent the Sarmatians, the Alans, and these various groups as well that appear beyond the Danube. But you take what's useful to you, and lots of them are of limited use, except in the rare circumstances that you're actually fighting a pitched battle against a Persian army with lots of these blokes. And that is so rare, but also you can deal with them by other means, by having some cataphracts in your army, but supported by other cavalry, because there are limits. You know, it is a fairly narrow way of thinking, and you do have to wonder, looking at the Persian side as well, whether there are cases where, when the Sassanians are fighting a war that is essentially a large-scale raid, or when they're fighting against steppe nomads, do they always deploy all their cataphracts with their full equipment? Or do they modify to the situation in the same way that they might choose to dismount to lead an attack, an assault on an enemy wall? Might you also say, well, look, it's not really worth having horse armour today? On the other hand, of course, when you're dealing with steppe armies that might have an awful lot of horse archers, good protection is a very good thing. And the emphasis you get in the perception of the Persians from later Roman sources, from the 6th century and beyond, as being very, very rigidly disciplined, very careful in the way they fought, not advancing recklessly, not pursuing recklessly, being ordered formations of troops that fight under the close control of their commanders, fight in a very disciplined way. All things that traditionally we've associated the Romans with doing, but they've learnt to do that partly through fighting the Romans, but also to a great extent fighting the steppe nomads, because if, as several kings of kings discovered to their great misfortune, if you let yourself be lured by the nomads, if you let yourselves get tired, attack in unfavourable circumstances, famously, according to at least one tradition, be lured into a concealed ditch, that can lead to disaster. So you have to be careful. You can't fight them on their own terms. You have to make sure they fight you on your terms. So there also, I mean, it's another thing as well. We'll focus on how do the Persians fight the Romans, but that's not the only thing Persian armies are doing and Persian kings of kings are thinking about. They have to deal with other military problems as well. And the reason the empire is so successful, just like the Roman Empire, is that they find a balanced way of fighting and dealing with different military problems. And they adapt. So we see them, because nearly all our sources talk about them confronting the Romans, fighting in a particular way for those circumstances. But these are smart, capable people who then might well fight in a different way when it makes sense to do so. So it's all part of a broader context. And if you look at the hints even of the battles where there are serious Roman defeats, it doesn't seem to be the case they keep on losing to mass charges by lots of cataphracts. That might sometimes happen, it probably does. And particularly once those cataphracts have deluged you with arrows and weakened you and then come in and hit you hard. But there isn't a sort of simple, this is why they win, this is why we lose, therefore we need to do something about this. Again, it comes back to reminding ourselves these are two very active players, even in these campaigns, that go off doing other things as well. So they've got experience of other ideas, other ways of fighting, other ways of operating. But when Persians confront Romans, they have to think in a particular way, and they have to outwit that Roman enemy, and the Romans are thinking in exactly the same way. So there's a lot of individual circumstances rather than, again, because the evidence stands out, this is how we tend to reconstruct ancient armies. We can see them as a sort of structural thing. This is their equipment, this is the tactics that we envisage this equipment was good at, that's what they do, therefore they win, therefore they lose. And we don't think about the peculiarities of the situation, whether, you know, this is a well-led army, a well-inspired army, a well-fed army, a healthy army. All of the factors, what the terrain is like, what the particular objective is at that time, and what, of course, the other side are doing. Because neither the Romans or Persians are there to make it easy for the other side. So it comes back to reminding ourselves of all we lack, of all the detail. When we look at Carhae, when we look at the other fragments of campaigns with Antony or Ventidius, or to some extent Nero's forces in Armenia, we can see a sense of this sort of cat and mouse game of each side trying to outwit the other in these operations. And it's there as well, more fully in Ammianus, in Procopius and others. We don't have that information for all these other campaigns, but it's logical to assume that that's exactly what's going on then. That people are trying to gain an advantage, and there's lots more adaptation, there's lots more ideas, there's lots more generals trying to outthink the other side, and luck playing a factor, and the weather playing a factor, and all these other things that can play into effectiveness and the decision of the campaign, let alone on the battlefield. So these are good questions to ask about, you know, why does one side fight in this way and have lots of people doing this, and why don't the Romans seem to match it? Because it makes us consider all these other options, and there's far more we could talk about, though again it would be conjecture about Persian economy, Persian society, Roman economy and society, about how you're obtaining horses and what sort of horses, where again there are little fragments of information, but so much must be guesswork that underlies this, but also more detail as to just how Parthian and then Sassanian Persian society works, how training is done in the Roman army. We know so little about what's going on later on. You know, we think we get more of a sense of the army of the Principate, but many of these big confrontations with the Persians are coming later on. So even to the extent of, you know, what size horses are being used, there's very little evidence for that, partly because there's not much skeletal evidence that are definitely military horses, but also if you find a small horse on a Roman site, or its remains of 12 hands, say, was that a cavalry mount? If so, it seems very small, even by Napoleonic standards. You know, the 14 hands, which is quite common for some of the bone finds where there have been more, and we can identify them as Roman military, fits pretty well with early 19th century, late 18th century light cavalry in particular in, say, Wellington's army or Napoleon's army. And is still, yeah, it's not huge, it does look a bit pony club to us, but it's still, if it's bearing down on you, is fairly intimidating with a rider on top who doesn't mean you any good. And there are a few cases where there are substantially larger horses, but are the small ones, the very small ones, are they pack animals rather than, or draft horses rather than cavalry mounts? It's so difficult to tell because again we just have little glimpses, and while there are papyri recording horses being enrolled in Roman army units, particularly from during Europa, so you've got 3rd century AD examples of a description of a horse, its colour, any distinguishing features, and which soldier has this mount allocated to him. And it's very similar, in fact, to the sort of administrative way that they process human recruits as well. Doesn't mention height. Does tend to mention age, and they seem fairly young, we would think, by our standards. But it doesn't tell us about height as often, which presumably means they didn't think it was necessary. But We don't know what criteria they were using, what was felt to be an appropriate size for the mount of a man in an ala or the mount of a horseman within a cohort like this one. Again, we're told by Hadrian in his speech at Lambaesis that they had lower quality, cheaper horses in the cohorts compared to the ally, but did that mean smaller as well, or just the sort of the second pick of the bunch rather than the very top? So there are all sorts of things, and it's something that it's always useful when you think about any of these issues to try and broaden it out and see, well, okay, there isn't just a simple thing that you pick your army as this is the best possible technology, equipment, tactics that are going to win us the battle, so that's what we're going to have. All of these armies are products of the political systems, the societies, the economies that underlie them, and then have to balance that military desire for, okay, what's the best way to fight, what's the best way to win, but also the, well, who are we fighting most of the time, what are we doing most of the time, how do we do that? Is this battle something we prepare for all our military lives, or is it one of the many things we prepare for and not necessarily the greatest priority at all levels? So hopefully, as is usual, and as with most of these videos, you can sum it up by saying, well, there's so much we don't really know, and we're not sure about that, and we're guessing. As I say, hopefully there is use in the exercise of thinking it through and wondering these things, because when you think about a particular question, it does force you to ask lots of other questions, and even if we can't answer them definitely, nevertheless, they're worth asking, they're worth considering, they're worth thinking about, okay, what evidence do we have about this? So hopefully this is something a little bit different, a little bit of interest, and as it goes along, all these videos are going to have to fit in when I can find some spare time to record them, but I'll start doing some more of these. So again, anybody out there who wants me to talk about a particular thing, keep on posting it in the comments or email me via the website, and I'll see what I can do, and I will try to cover them eventually, but it may take a while because I've got the next book to write as well, so I'm at the research stage for that one, and that's keeping me pretty busy. Anyway, thanks for listening.